Chapter 3 of the Birth of Tragedy by Friedrich Nietzsche. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3. In order to comprehend this, we must take down the artistic structure of the Apollonian culture, as it were, stone by stone, till we behold the foundations on which it rests. Here we observe, first of all, the glorious Olympian figures of the gods, standing on the gables of this structure, whose deeds, represented in far shining reliefs, adorn its friezes. Though Apollo stands among them as an individual deity, side by side with others, and without claim to priority of rank, we must not suffer this fact to mislead us. The same impulse which embodied itself in Apollo has in general given birth to this whole Olympian world, and in this sense we may regard Apollo as the father thereof. What was the enormous need from which proceeded such an illustrious group of Olympian beings? Whosoever with another religion in his heart approaches these Olympians and seeks among them for moral elevation, even for sanctity, for incorporeal spiritualization, for sympathetic looks of love, will soon be obliged to turn his back on them, discouraged and disappointed. Here nothing suggests asceticism, spirituality, or duty. Here only an exuberant, even triumphant life speaks to us, in which everything existing is deified, whether good or bad, and so the spectator will perhaps stand quite bewildered before this fantastic exuberance of life, and ask himself what magic potion these madly merry men could have used for enjoying life, so that wherever they turned their eyes, Helena, the ideal image of their own existence, floating in sweet sensuality, smiled upon them. But to this spectator, already turning backwards, we must call out, depart not hence, but hear rather what Greek folk wisdom says of this same life, which with such inexplicable cheerfulness spreads out before thee. There is an ancient story that King Midas hunted in the forest a long time for the wise Silenus, the companion of Dionysus, without capturing him. When at last he fell into his hands, the king asked what was best of all, and most desirable for man. Fixed and immovable, the demon remained silent, till at last, forced by the king, he broke out with shrill laughter into these words: "O wretched race of a day, children of chance and misery, why do ye compel me to say to you what it were most expedient for you not to hear? What is best of all is for ever beyond your reach. Not to be born, not to be nothing. The second best for you, however, is soon to die." How is the Olympian world of deities related to this folk wisdom, even as the rapturous vision of the tortured martyr to his sufferings? Now the Olympian magic mountain opens, as it were, to our view, and shows to us its roots. The Greek knew and felt the terrors and horrors of existence. To be able to live at all, he had to interpose the shining green birth of the Olympian world between himself and them. The excessive distrust of the titanic powers of nature, the Moira throning inexorably over all knowledge, the vulture of the great philanthropist Prometheus, the terrible fate of the wise Oedipus, the family curse of the Atridae, which drove Orestes to matricide, in short, that entire philosophy of the sylvan god with its mythical exemplars, which wrought the ruin of the melancholy Etruscans, was again and again surmounted anew by the Greeks through the artistic middle world of the Olympians, or at least veiled and withdrawn from sight. To be able to live, the Greeks had, from direst necessity, to create these gods, which process we may perhaps picture to ourselves in this manner. that out of the original Titan thearchy of terror, the Olympian thearchy of joy was evolved by slow transitions through the Apollonian impulse to beauty, even as roses break forth from thorny bushes. How else could this so sensitive people, so vehement in its desires, so singularly qualified for sufferings, have endured existence, if it had not been exhibited to them in their gods, surrounded with a higher glory? The same impulse which calls art into being, as the complement and consummation of existence, seducing to a continuation of life, caused also the Olympian world to arise, in which the Hellenic will held up before itself a transfiguring mirror. Thus do the gods justify the life of man, in that they themselves live it, the only satisfactory theodicy. Existence under the bright sunshine of such gods is regarded as that which is desirable in itself, and the real grief of the Homeric men has reference to parting from it, especially to early parting, so that we might now say of them, with a reversion of the Silenian wisdom, that to die early is worst of all for them. The second worst is some day to die at all. If once the lamentation is heard, it will ring out again, of the short-lived Achilles, of the leaf-like change and vicissitude of the human race, of the decay of the heroic age. It is not unworthy of the greatest hero to long for a continuation of life, ay, even as a day labourer. So vehemently does the will, at the Apollonian stage of development, long for this existence, so completely at one does the Homeric man feel himself with it, that the very lamentation becomes its song of praise. Here we must observe that this harmony which is so eagerly contemplated by modern man, in fact this oneness of man with nature, to express which Schiller introduced the technical term naïve, is by no means such a simple, naturally resulting, and as it were inevitable condition, which must be found at the gate of every culture leading to a paradise of man. This could be believed only by an age which sought to picture to itself Rousseau's Emile also as an artist, and imagined it had found in Homer such an artist Emile, reared at nature's bosom. Wherever we meet with the naïve in art, it behooves us to recognize the highest effect of the Apollonian culture, which in the first place has always to overthrow some titanic empire and slay monsters, and which, through powerful dazzling representations and pleasurable illusions, must have triumphed over a terrible depth of world contemplation and a most keen susceptibility to suffering. But how seldom is the naïve, that complete absorption in the beauty of appearance, attained! And hence how inexpressibly sublime is Homer, who, as unit being, bears the same relation to this Apollonian folk culture as the unit dream artist does to the dream faculty of the people and of nature in general. The Homeric naivete can be comprehended only as the complete triumph of the Apollonian illusion. It is the same kind of illusion as nature so frequently employs to compass her ends. The true goal is veiled by a phantasm. We stretch out our hands for the latter, while nature attains the former through our illusion. In the Greeks, the will desired to contemplate itself in the transfiguration of the genius and the world of art. In order to glorify themselves, its creatures had to feel themselves worthy of glory. They had to behold themselves again in a higher sphere. Without this consummate world of contemplation acting as an imperative or reproach. Such is the sphere of beauty in which, as in a mirror, they saw their images, the Olympians. With this mirroring of beauty, the Hellenic will combated its talent, correlative to the artistic, for suffering and for the wisdom of suffering, and as a monument of its victory, Homer, the naïve artist, stands before us. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of the Birth of Tragedy by Friedrich Nietzsche. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4. Concerning this naive artist, the analogy of dreams will enlighten us to some extent, when we realize to ourselves the dreamer as in the midst of the illusion of the dream world, and without disturbing it, he calls out to himself, "It is a dream, I will dream on," when we must thence infer a deep inner joy in dream contemplation; when, on the other hand, to be at all able to dream with this inner joy in contemplation, we must have completely forgotten the day and its terrible obtrusiveness. We may, under the direction of the dream-reading Apollo, interpret all these phenomena to ourselves somewhat as follows. Though it is certain that of the two halves of life, the waking and the dreaming, the former appeals to us as by far the more preferred, important, excellent, and worthy of being lived, indeed, as that which alone is lived; yet with reference to that mysterious ground of our being, of which we are the phenomenon, I should, paradoxical as it may seem, be inclined to maintain the very opposite estimate of the value of dream life. For the more clearly I perceive in nature those all powerful art impulses, and in them a fervent longing for appearance, for redemption through appearance, the more I feel myself driven to the metaphysical assumption that the verily existent and primordial unity, as the eternally suffering and self-contradictory, requires the rapturous vision, the joyful appearance, for its continuous salvation; which appearance we, who are completely wrapped in it and composed of it, must regard as the verily non-existent, that is, as a perpetual unfolding in time, space, and causality, in other words, as empiric reality. If we therefore waive the consideration of our own reality for the present, if we conceive our empiric existence, and that of the world generally, as a representation of the primordial unity, generated every moment, we shall then have to regard the dream as an appearance of appearance; hence as a still higher gratification of the primordial desire for appearance. It is for this same reason that the innermost heart of nature experiences that indescribable joy in the naive artist, and in the naive work of art, which is likewise only an appearance of appearance. In a symbolic painting, Raphael himself, one of these immortal naive ones, has represented to us this depotentiating of appearance to appearance, the primordial process of the naive artist, and at the same time of Apollonian culture. In his Transfiguration, the lower half, with the possessed boy, the despairing bearers, the helpless terrified disciples, shows to us the reflection of eternal primordial pain, the sole basis of the world. The appearance here is the counter appearance of eternal contradiction, the father of things. Out of this appearance then arises, like an ambrosial vapor, a vision like new world of appearances, of which those wrapped in the first appearance see nothing; a radiant floating in purest bliss and painless contemplation, beaming from wide open eyes. Here there is presented to our view, in the highest symbolism of art, that Apollonian world of beauty and its substratum, the terrible wisdom of Silenus, and we comprehend by intuition their necessary interdependence. Apollo, however, again appears to us as the apotheosis of the principium individuationis, in which alone the perpetually attained end of the primordial unity, its redemption through appearance, is consummated. He shows us, with sublime attitudes, how the entire world of torment is necessary, that thereby the individual may be impelled to realize the redeeming vision; and then, sunk in contemplation thereof, quietly sit in his fluctuating bark in the midst of the sea. This apotheosis of individuation, if it be at all conceived as imperative and laying down precepts, knows but one law, the individual, that is, the observance of the boundaries of the individual measure in the Hellenic sense. Apollo, as ethical deity, demands due proportion of his disciples, and that this may be observed, he demands self-knowledge. And thus, parallel to the aesthetic necessity for beauty, there run the demands, know thyself, and not too much, while presumption and undueness are regarded as the truly hostile demons of the non-Apollonian sphere, hence as characteristics of the pre-Apollonian age, that of the Titans, and of the extra-Apollonian world, that of the barbarians. Because of his Titan-like love for man, Prometheus had to be torn to pieces by vultures. Because of his excessive wisdom, which solved the riddle of the Sphinx, Oedipus had to plunge into a bewildering vortex of monstrous crimes. Thus did the Delphic god interpret the Grecian past. So also the effects wrought by the Dionysian appeared titanic and barbaric to the Apollonian Greek, while at the same time he could not conceal from himself that he too was inwardly related to these overthrown Titans and heroes. Indeed, he had to recognize still more than this. His entire existence, with all its beauty and moderation, rested on a hidden substratum of suffering and of knowledge, which was again disclosed to him by the Dionysian. And lo, Apollo could not live without Dionysus. The Titanic and the barbaric were in the end not less necessary than the Apollonian. And now let us imagine to ourselves how the ecstatic tone of the Dionysian festival sounded in ever more luring and bewitching strains into this artificially confined world built on appearance and moderation. How in these strains all the undueness of nature, in joy, sorrow, and knowledge, even to the transpiercing shriek, became audible. Let us ask ourselves what meaning could be attached to the psalmodizing artist of Apollo with the phantom harp sound, as compared with this demonic folk song. The muses of the arts of appearance paled before an art which, in its intoxication, spoke the truth. The wisdom of Silenus cried, "Woe, woe!" against the cheerful Olympians. The individual, with all his boundaries and due proportions, went under in the self-oblivion of the Dionysian states, and forgot the Apollonian precepts. The undueness revealed itself as truth; contradiction, the bliss born of pain, declared itself but of the heart of nature. And thus wherever the Dionysian prevailed, the Apollonian was routed and annihilated. But it is quite as certain that, where the first assault was successfully withstood, the authority and majesty of the Delphic god exhibited itself as more rigid and menacing than ever. For I can only explain to myself the Doric state and Doric art as a permanent war camp of the Apollonian, only by incessant opposition to the titanic barbaric nature of the Dionysian was it possible for an art so defiantly prim, so encompassed with bulwarks, a training so warlike and rigorous, a constitution so cruel and relentless, to last for any length of time. Up to this point we have enlarged upon the observation made at the beginning of this essay, how the Dionysian and the Apollonian, in ever new births, succeeding and mutually augmenting one another, controlled the Hellenic genius. How from out the age of bronze, with its Titan struggles and rigorous folk philosophy, the Homeric world develops under the fostering sway of the Apollonian impulse to beauty. How this naive splendor is again overwhelmed by the inbursting flood of the Dionysian, and how against this new power the Apollonian rises to the austere majesty of Doric art and the Doric view of things. If then, in this way, in the strife of these two hostile principles, The older Hellenic history falls into four great periods of art. We are now driven to inquire after the ulterior purpose of these unfoldings and processes, unless perchance we should regard the last attained period, the period of Doric art, as the end and aim of these artistic impulses. And here the sublime and highly celebrated artwork of Attic tragedy and dramatic dithyramb presents itself to our view as the common goal of both these impulses, whose mysterious union, after many and long precursory struggles, found its glorious consummation in such a child, which is at once Antigone and Cassandra. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of the Birth of Tragedy by Friedrich Nietzsche. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5. We now approach the real purpose of our investigation, which aims at acquiring a knowledge of the Dionyso-Apollonian genius and his artwork, or at least an anticipatory understanding of the mystery of the aforesaid union. Here we shall ask first of all where that new germ, which subsequently developed into tragedy and dramatic dithyramb, first makes itself perceptible in the Hellenic world. The ancients themselves supply the answer in symbolic form, when they place Homer and Archilochus as the forefathers and torch-bearers of Greek poetry side by side on gems, sculptures, etc., in the sure conviction that only these two thoroughly original compeers, from whom a stream of fire flows over the whole of Greek posterity, should be taken into consideration. Homer, the aged dreamer, sunk in himself, the type of the Apollonian naive artist, beholds now with astonishment the impassioned genius of the warlike votary of the Muses, Archilochus, violently tossed to and fro on the billows of existence, and modern aesthetics could only add by way of interpretation that here the objective artist is confronted by the first subjective artist. But this interpretation is of little service to us, because we know the subjective artist only as the poor artist, and in every type and elevation of art we demand specially and first of all the conquest of the subjective, the redemption from the ego, and the cessation of every individual will and desire. Indeed, we find it impossible to believe in any truly artistic production, however insignificant, without objectivity, without pure, interestless contemplation. Hence, our aesthetics must first solve the problem as to how the lyrist is possible as an artist. He who, according to the experience of all ages, continually says I, and sings off to us the entire chromatic scale of his passions and desires, this very Archilochus appalls us, alongside of Homer, by his cries of hatred and scorn, by the drunken outbursts of his desire. Is not just he, then, who has been called the first subjective artist, the non-artist proper? But whence, then, the reverence which was shown to him, the poet, in very remarkable utterances, by the Delphic oracle itself, the focus of objective art? Schiller has enlightened us concerning his poetic procedure by a psychological observation, inexplicable to himself, yet not, apparently, open to any objection. He acknowledges that as the preparatory state to the act of poetizing, he had not, perhaps, before him, or within him, a series of pictures with coordinate causalities of thoughts, but rather a musical mood. The perception with me is at first without a clear and definite object. This forms itself later. A certain musical mood of mind precedes, and only after this does the poetical idea follow with me. Add to this the most important phenomenon of all ancient lyric poetry, the union, regarded everywhere as natural, of the lyrist with the musician, their very identity indeed, compared with which our modern lyric poetry is like the statue of a god without a head, and we may now, on the basis of our metaphysics of aesthetics set forth above, interpret the lyrist to ourselves as follows. As Dionysian artist, he is in the first place become altogether one with the primordial unity, its pain and contradiction, and he produces the copy of this primordial unity as music, granting that music has been correctly termed a repetition and a recast of the world. But now, under the Apollonian dream inspiration, this music again becomes visible to him, as in a symbolic dream picture. The formless and intangible reflection of the primordial pain in music, with its redemption in appearance, then generates a second mirroring as a concrete symbol or example. The artist has already surrendered his subjectivity in the Dionysian process. The picture which now shows to him his oneness with the heart of the world is a dream scene which embodies the primordial contradiction and primordial pain, together with the primordial joy of appearance. The I of the lyrist sounds therefore from the abyss of being. Its subjectivity, in the sense of the modern aesthetes, is a fiction. When Archilochus, the first lyrist of the Greeks, makes known both his mad love and his contempt to the daughters of Lycambes, it is not his passion which dances before us in orgiastic frenzy. We see Dionysus and the Maenads, we see the drunken reveler Archilochus sunk down to sleep, as Euripides depicts it in the Bacchae, the sleep on the high alpine pasture in the noonday sun. And now Apollo approaches and touches him with the laurel. The Dionyso-musical enchantment of the sleeper now emits, as it were, picture sparks, lyrical poems, which in their highest development are called tragedies, and dramatic dithyrambs. The plastic artist, as also the epic poet, who is related to him, is sunk in the pure contemplation of pictures. The Dionysian musician is, without any picture, himself just primordial pain, and the primordial re-echoing thereof. The lyric genius is conscious of a world of pictures and symbols, growing out of the state of mystical self-abnegation and oneness, which has a coloring, causality, and velocity quite different from that of the world of the plastic artist and epic poet. While the latter lives in these pictures, and only in them, with joyful satisfaction, and never grows tired of contemplating them with love, even in their minutest characters, while even the picture of the angry Achilles is to him but a picture, the angry expression of which he enjoys with the dream joy in appearance, so that by this mirror of appearance he is guarded against being unified and blending with his figures. The pictures of the lyrist, on the other hand, are nothing but his very self, and as it were only different projections of himself, on account of which he, as the moving centre of this world, is entitled to say I. Only, of course, this self is not the same as that of the waking, empirically real man, but the only verily existent and eternal self resting at the basis of things, by means of the images whereof the lyric genius sees through even to this basis of things. Now let us suppose that he beholds himself also among these images as non-genius, that is, his subject, the whole throng of subjective passions and impulses of the will directed to a definite object which appears real to him, If now it seems as if the lyric genius and the allied non-genius were one, and as if the former spoke that little word I of his own accord, this appearance will no longer be able to lead us astray, as it certainly led those astray who designated the lyrist as the subjective poet. In truth, Archilochus, the passionately inflamed, loving, and hating man, is but a vision of the genius, who by this time is no longer Archilochus, but a genius of the world, who expresses his primordial pain symbolically in the figure of the man Archilochus; while the subjectively willing and desiring man, Archilochus, can never at any time be a poet. It is by no means necessary, however, that the lyrist should see nothing but the phenomenon of the man Archilochus before him, as a reflection of eternal being; and tragedy shows how far the visionary world of the lyrist may depart from this phenomenon, to which of course it is most intimately related. Schopenhauer, who did not shut his eyes to the difficulty presented by the lyrist in the philosophical contemplation of art, thought he had found a way out of it, on which, however, I cannot accompany him, while he alone, in his profound metaphysics of music, held in his hands the means whereby this difficulty could be definitely removed, as I believe I have removed it here, in his spirit and to his honor. In contrast to our view, he describes the peculiar nature of song as follows: Welt aus Wille und Vorstellung, 1-95. It is the subject of the will, that is, his own volition, which fills the consciousness of the singer, often as an unbound and satisfied desire, joy, but still more often as a restricted desire, grief, always as an emotion, a passion, or an agitated frame of mind. Besides this, however, and along with it, by the sight of surrounding nature, the singer becomes conscious of himself as the subject of pure will-less knowing, the unbroken blissful peace of which now appears, in contrast to the stress of desire, which is always restricted and always needy. The feeling of this contrast, this alternation, is really what the song as a whole expresses, and what principally constitutes the lyrical state of mind. In it, pure knowing comes to us, as it were, to deliver us from desire and the stress thereof. We follow, but only for an instant; for desire, the remembrance of our personal ends, tears us anew from peaceful contemplation. Yet ever again the next beautiful surrounding in which the pure will-less knowledge presents itself to us, allures us away from desire. Therefore, in song and in the lyrical mood, desire, the personal interest of the ends, and the pure perception of the surrounding which presents itself, are wonderfully mingled with each other. Connections between them are sought for and imagined. The subjective disposition, the affection of the will, imparts its own hue to the contemplated surrounding, and conversely, the surroundings communicate the reflex of their color to the will. The true song is the expression of the whole of this mingled and divided state of mind. Who could fail to see in this description that lyric poetry is here characterized as an imperfectly attained art, which seldom, and only, as it were, in leaps, arrives at its goal, indeed as a semi-art, the essence of which is said to consist in this, that desire and pure contemplation, that is, the unaesthetic and the aesthetic condition, are wonderfully mingled with each other. We maintain rather that this entire antithesis, according to which, as according to some standard of value, Schopenhauer too still classifies the arts, the antithesis between the subjective and the objective is quite out of place in aesthetics, inasmuch as the subject, that is, the desiring individual, who furthers his own egoistic ends, can be conceived only as the adversary, not as the origin of art. In so far as the subject is the artist, however, he has already been released from his individual will, and has become, as it were, the medium through which the one verily existent subject celebrates his redemption in appearance. For this one thing must above all be clear to us, to our humiliation and exaltation, that the entire comedy of art is not at all performed, say, for our betterment and culture, and that we are just as little the true authors of this art world. Rather, we may assume with regard to ourselves that its true author uses us as pictures and artistic projections, and that we have our highest dignity and our significance as works of art, for only as an aesthetic phenomenon is existence and the world eternally justified. While, of course, our consciousness of this, our specific significance, hardly differs from the kind of consciousness which the soldiers painted on canvas have of the battle represented thereon. Hence, all our knowledge of art is at bottom quite illusory, because as knowing persons we are not one and identical with the being who, as the sole author and spectator of this comedy of art, prepares a perpetual entertainment for himself, only in so far as the genius in the act of artistic production coalesces with this primordial artist of the world, does he get a glimpse of the eternal essence of art. For in this state he is, in a marvelous manner, like the weird picture of the fairy tale, which can at will turn its eyes and behold itself. He is now at once subject and object, at once poet, actor, and spectator. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of the Birth of Tragedy by Friedrich Nietzsche. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6. With reference to Archilochus, it has been established by critical research that he introduced the folk song into literature, and, on account thereof, deserved, according to the general estimate of the Greeks, his unique position alongside of Homer. But what is this popular folk song in contrast to the holy Apollonian epos? What else but the perpetuum vestigium of a union of the Apollonian and the Dionysian? Its enormous diffusion among all peoples, still further enhanced by ever new births, testifies to the power of this artistic double impulse of nature, which leaves its vestiges in the popular song, in like manner as the orgiastic movements of a people perpetuate themselves in its music. Indeed, one might also furnish historical proofs that every period which is highly productive in popular songs has been most violently stirred by Dionysian currents, which we must always regard as the substratum and prerequisite of the popular song. First of all, however, we regard the popular song as the musical mirror of the world, as the original melody which now seeks for itself a parallel dream phenomenon, and expresses it in poetry. Melody is therefore primary and universal, and as such may admit of several objectivations in several texts. Likewise, in the naive estimation of the people, it is regarded as by far the more important and necessary. Melody generates the poem out of itself by an ever recurring process. The strophic form of the popular song points to the same phenomenon, which I always beheld with astonishment, till at last I found this explanation. Any one who, in accordance with this theory, examines a collection of popular songs, such as Des Knaben Wunderhorn, will find innumerable instances of the perpetually productive melody scattering picture sparks all around, which in their variegation, their abrupt change, their mad precipitance, manifest a power quite unknown to the epic appearance and its steady flow. From the point of view of the epos, this unequal and irregular pictorial world of lyric poetry must be simply condemned, and the solemn epic rhapsodists of the Apollonian festivals in the age of Terpander have certainly done so. Accordingly, we observe that in the poetizing of the popular song, language is strained to its utmost to imitate music, and hence a new world of poetry begins with Archilochus, which is fundamentally opposed to the Homeric. And in saying this we have pointed out the only possible relation between poetry and music, between word and tone. The word, the picture, the concept here seeks an expression analogous to music, and now experiences in itself the power of music. In this sense we may discriminate between two main currents in the history of the language of the Greek people, according as their language imitated either the world of phenomena and of pictures, or the world of music. One has only to reflect seriously on the linguistic difference with regard to color, syntactical structure, and vocabulary in Homer and Pindar, in order to comprehend the significance of this contrast. Indeed, it becomes palpably clear to us that in the period between Homer and Pindar, the orgiastic flute tones of Olympus must have sounded forth, which in an age as late as Aristotle's, when music was infinitely more developed, transported people to drunken enthusiasm, and which, when their influence was first felt, undoubtedly incited all the poetic means of expression of contemporaneous man to imitation. I here call attention to a familiar phenomenon of our own times, against which our aesthetics raises many objections. We again and again have occasion to observe how a symphony of Beethoven compels the individual hearers to use figurative speech, though the appearance presented by a collocation of the different pictorial world generated by a piece of music may be never so fantastically diversified and even contradictory. To practice its small wit on such compositions, and to overlook a phenomenon which is certainly worth explaining, is quite in keeping with this aesthetics. Indeed, even if the tone poet has spoken in pictures concerning a composition, when, for instance, he designates a certain symphony as the Pastoral Symphony, or a passage therein as the Scene by the Brook, or another as the Merry Gathering of Rustics, these are likewise only symbolical representations born out of music, and not perhaps the imitated objects of music, representations which can give us no information whatever concerning the Dionysian content of music, and which in fact have no distinctive value of their own alongside of other pictorial expressions. This process of a discharge of music in pictures we have now to transfer to some youthful, linguistically productive people, to get a notion as to how the strophic popular song originates, and how the entire faculty of speech is stimulated by this new principle of imitation of music. If, therefore, we may regard lyric poetry as the effulgeration of music in pictures and concepts, we can now ask, how does music appear in the mirror of symbolism and conception? It appears as will, taking the word in the Schopenhauerian sense, that is, as the antithesis of the aesthetic, purely contemplative and passive frame of mind. Here, however, we must discriminate as sharply as possible between the concept of essentiality and the concept of phenomenality, for music according to its essence cannot be will, because as such it would have to be wholly banished from the domain of art, for the will is the unaesthetic in itself, yet it appears as will. For in order to express the phenomenon of music in pictures, the lyrist requires all the stirrings of passion, from the whispering of infant desire to the roaring of madness. Under the impulse to speak of music in Apollonian symbols, he conceives of all nature and himself therein only as the eternally willing, desiring, longing existence. But in so far as he interprets music by means of pictures, he himself rests in the quiet calm of Apollonian contemplation, however much all around him which he beholds through the medium of music is in a state of confused and violent motion. Indeed, when he beholds himself through this same medium, his own image appears to him in a state of unsatisfied feeling. His own willing, longing, moaning, and rejoicing are to him symbols by which he interprets music. Such is the phenomenon of the lyrist. As Apollonian genius, he interprets music through the image of the will, while he himself, completely released from the avidity of the will, is the pure, undimmed eye of day. Our whole disquisition insists on this, that lyric poetry is dependent on the spirit of music, just as music itself, in its absolute sovereignty, does not require the picture and the concept, but only endures them as accompaniments. The poems of the lyrist can express nothing which has not already been contained in the vast universality and absoluteness of the music which compelled him to use figurative speech. By no means is it possible for language adequately to render the cosmic symbolism of music, for the very reason that music stands in symbolic relation to the primordial contradiction and primordial pain in the heart of the primordial unity, and therefore symbolizes a sphere which is above all appearance and before all phenomena. Rather should we say that all phenomena compared with it are but symbols. Hence language, as the organ and symbol of phenomena, cannot at all disclose the innermost essence of music. Language can only be in superficial contact with music when it attempts to imitate music, while the profoundest significance of the latter cannot be brought one step nearer to us by all the eloquence of lyric poetry. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of the Birth of Tragedy by Friedrich Nietzsche. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7. We shall now have to avail ourselves of all the principles of art hitherto considered, in order to find our way through the labyrinth, as we must designate the origin of Greek tragedy. I shall not be charged with absurdity in saying that the problem of this origin has as yet not even been seriously stated, not to say solved, however often the fluttering tatters of ancient tradition have been sewed together in sundry combinations and torn asunder again. This tradition tells us in the most unequivocal terms that tragedy sprang from the tragic chorus, and was originally only chorus and nothing but chorus, and hence we feel it our duty to look into the heart of this tragic chorus as being the real proto-drama, without in the least contenting ourselves with current art phraseology, according to which the chorus is the ideal spectator, or represents the people in contrast to the regal side of the scene. The latter explanatory notion, which sounds sublime to many a politician, that the immutable moral law was embodied by the democratic Athenians in the popular chorus, which always carries its point over the passionate excesses and extravagances of kings, may be ever so forcibly suggested by an observation of Aristotle. Still it has no bearing on the original formation of tragedy, inasmuch as the entire antithesis of king and people, and in general the whole politico-social sphere, is excluded from the purely religious beginnings of tragedy. But considering the well-known classical form of the chorus in Aeschylus and Sophocles, we should even deem it blasphemy to speak here of the anticipation of a constitutional representation of the people, from which blasphemy others have not shrunk, however. The ancient governments knew of no constitutional representation of the people in praxi, and it is to be hoped that they did not even so much as anticipate it in tragedy. Much more celebrated than this political explanation of the chorus is the notion of A. W. Schlegel, who advises us to regard the chorus in a manner as the essence and extract of the crowd of spectators, as the ideal spectator. This view, when compared with the historical tradition that tragedy was originally only chorus, reveals itself in its true character as a crude, unscientific, yet brilliant assertion, which, however, has acquired its brilliancy only through its concentrated form of expression, through the truly Germanic bias in favor of whatever is called ideal, and through our momentary astonishment. For we are indeed astonished the moment we compare our well-known theatrical public with this chorus, and ask ourselves if it could ever be possible to idealize something analogous to the Greek chorus out of such a public. We tacitly deny this, and now wonder as much at the boldness of Schlegel's assertion as at the totally different nature of the Greek public. For hitherto we always believed that the true spectator, be he who he may, had always to remain conscious of having before him a work of art, and not an empiric reality, whereas the tragic chorus of the Greeks is compelled to recognize real beings in the figures of the stage. The chorus of the Oceanides really believes that it sees before it the Titan Prometheus, and considers itself as real as the god of the scene. And are we to own that he is the highest and purest type of a spectator, who, like the Oceanides, regards Prometheus as real and present in body? And is it characteristic of the ideal spectator that he should run on the stage and free the god from his torments? We had believed in an aesthetic public, and considered the individual spectator the better qualified the more he was capable of viewing a work of art as art, that is, aesthetically. But now the Schlegelian expression has intimated to us that the perfect ideal spectator does not at all suffer the world of the scenes to act aesthetically on him, but corporeo empirically. Oh, these Greeks, we have sighed, they will upset our aesthetics. But once accustomed to it, we have reiterated the saying of Schlegel as often as the subject of the chorus has been broached. But the tradition which is so explicit here speaks against Schlegel. The chorus as such, without the stage, the primitive form of tragedy, and the chorus of ideal spectators do not harmonize. What kind of art would that be which was extracted from the concept of the spectator, and whereof we are to regard the spectator as such, as the true form? The spectator without the play is something absurd. We fear that the birth of tragedy can be explained neither by the high esteem for the moral intelligence of the multitude, nor by the concept of the spectator without the play; and we regard the problem as too deep to be even so much as touched by such superficial modes of contemplation. An infinitely more valuable insight into the signification of the chorus had already been displayed by Schiller in the celebrated preface to his Bride of Messina, where he regarded the chorus as a living wall, which tragedy draws round herself to guard her from contact with the world of reality, and to preserve her ideal domain and poetical freedom. It is with this, his chief weapon, that Schiller combats the ordinary conception of the natural, the illusion ordinarily required in dramatic poetry. He contends that while indeed the day on the stage is merely artificial, the architecture only symbolical, and the metrical dialogue purely ideal in character, nevertheless an erroneous view still prevails in the main, that it is not enough to tolerate merely as a poetical license that which is in reality the essence of all poetry. The introduction of the chorus is, he says, the decisive step by which war is declared openly and honestly against all naturalism in art. It is, methinks, for disparaging this mode of contemplation that our would-be superior age has coined the disdainful catchword pseudo-idealism. I fear, however, that we, on the other hand, with our present worship of the natural and the real, have landed at the nadir of all idealism, namely in the region of cabinets of wax figures. And art indeed exists also here, as in certain novels, much in vogue at present, but let no one pester us with the claim that by this art the Schiller-Goethean pseudo-idealism has been vanquished. It is indeed an ideal domain, as Schiller rightly perceived, upon which the Greek satiric chorus, the chorus of primitive tragedy, was wont to walk, a domain raised far above the actual path of mortals. The Greek framed for this chorus the suspended scaffolding of a fictitious natural state, and placed thereon fictitious natural beings. It is on this foundation that tragedy grew up, and so it could of course dispense from the very first with a painful portrayal of reality. Yet it is not an arbitrary world, placed by fancy betwixt heaven and earth; rather is it a world possessing the same reality and trustworthiness that Olympus with its dwellers possessed for the believing Hellene. The satyr, as being the Dionysian chorus, lives in a religiously acknowledged reality, under the sanction of the myth and cult. That tragedy begins with him, that the Dionysian wisdom of tragedy speaks through him, is just as surprising a phenomenon to us as in general the derivation of tragedy from the chorus. Perhaps we shall get a starting point for our inquiry, if I put forward the proposition that the satyr, the fictitious natural being, is to the man of culture what Dionysian music is to civilization. Concerning this latter, Richard Wagner says that it is neutralized by music, even as lamplight by daylight. In like manner, I believe the Greek man of culture felt himself neutralized in the presence of the satiric chorus, and this is the most immediate effect of the Dionysian tragedy, that the state and society, and in general the gaps between man and man, give way to an overwhelming feeling of oneness, which leads back to the heart of nature. The metaphysical comfort with which, as I have here intimated, every true tragedy dismisses us, that, in spite of the perpetual change of phenomena, life at bottom is indestructibly powerful and pleasurable, this comfort appears with corporeal lucidity as the satiric chorus, as the chorus of natural beings who live ineradicable, as it were, behind all civilization, and who, in spite of the ceaseless change of generations and the history of nations, remain for ever the same. With this chorus the deep-minded Hellene, who is so singularly qualified for the most delicate and severe suffering, consoles himself. He who has glanced with piercing eye into the very heart of the terrible destructive processes of so-called universal history, as also into the cruelty of nature, and is in danger of longing for a Buddhistic negation of the will, art saves him, and through art life saves him for herself. For we must know that in the rapture of the Dionysian state, with its annihilation of the ordinary bounds and limits of existence, there is a lethargic element wherein all personal experiences of the past are submerged. It is by this gulf of oblivion that the everyday world and the world of Dionysian reality are separated from each other. But as soon as this everyday reality rises again in consciousness, it is felt as such, and nauseates us. An ascetic will, a paralyzing mood, is the fruit of these states. In this sense, the Dionysian man may be said to resemble Hamlet. Both have for once seen into the true nature of things. They have perceived, but they are loath to act, for their action cannot change the eternal nature of things. They regard it as shameful or ridiculous that one should require of them to set aright the time which is out of joint. Knowledge kills action, action requires the veil of illusion. It is this lesson which Hamlet teaches, and not the cheap wisdom of John a Dreams, who from too much reflection, as it were from a surplus of possibilities, does not arrive at action at all. Not reflection, no, true knowledge, insight into appalling truth, preponderates over all motives inciting to action, in Hamlet as well as in the Dionysian man. No comfort avails any longer. His longing goes beyond a world after death, beyond the gods themselves. Existence, with its glittering reflection in the gods, or in an immortal other world, is abjured. In the consciousness of the truth he has perceived, man now sees everywhere only the awfulness or the absurdity of existence. He now understands the symbolism in the fate of Ophelia. He now discerns the wisdom of the sylvan god Silenus, and loathing seizes him. Here, in this extremest danger of the will, art approaches as a saving and healing enchantress. She alone is able to transform these nauseating reflections on the awfulness or absurdity of existence into representations wherewith it is possible to live. These are the representations of the sublime, as the artistic subjugation of the awful, and the comic as the artistic delivery from the nausea of the absurd. The satiric chorus of Dithyram is the saving deed of Greek art. The paroxysms described above spent their force in the intermediary world of these Dionysian followers. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of the Birth of Tragedy, by Friedrich Nietzsche. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8. The satyr, like the idyllic shepherd of our more recent time, is the offspring of a longing after the primitive and the natural. But mark with what firmness and fearlessness the Greek embraced the man of the woods, and again how coyly and mawkishly the modern man dallied with the flattering picture of a tender, flute-playing, soft-natured shepherd. Nature, on which as yet no knowledge has been at work, which maintains unbroken barriers to culture, this is what the Greek saw in his satyr, which still was not on this account supposed to coincide with the ape. On the contrary, it was the archetype of man, the embodiment of his highest and strongest emotions, as the enthusiastic reveller, enraptured by the proximity of his god, as the fellow-suffering companion, in whom the suffering of the god repeats itself, as the herald of wisdom, speaking from the very depths of nature, as the emblem of the sexual omnipotence of nature, which the Greek was wont to contemplate with reverential awe. The satyr was something sublime and godlike. He could not but appear so, especially to the sad and wearied eye of the Dionysian man. He would have been offended by our spurious, tricked-up shepherd, while his eye dwelt with sublime satisfaction on the naked and unstuntedly magnificent characters of nature. Here the illusion of culture was brushed away from the archetype of man. Here the true man, the bearded satyr, revealed himself, who shouts joyfully to his god. Before him the cultured man shrank to a lying caricature. Schiller is right also with reference to these beginnings of tragic art. The chorus is a living bulwark against the onsets of reality, because it, the satiric chorus, portrays existence more truthfully, more realistically, more perfectly than the cultured man, who ordinarily considers himself as the only reality. The sphere of poetry does not lie outside the world, like some fantastic impossibility of a poet's imagination. It seeks to be the very opposite, the unvarnished expression of truth, and must for this very reason cast aside the false finery of that supposed reality of the cultured man. The contrast between this intrinsic truth of nature and the falsehood of culture, which poses as the only reality, is similar to that existing between the eternal kernel of things, the thing in itself, and the collective world of phenomena. And even as tragedy, with its metaphysical comfort, points to the eternal life of this kernel of existence, notwithstanding the perpetual dissolution of phenomena, so the symbolism of the satiric chorus already expresses figuratively this primordial relation between the thing in itself and phenomenon. The idyllic shepherd of the modern man is but a copy of the sum of the illusions of culture, which he calls nature. The Dionysian Greek desires truth and nature in their most potent form. He sees himself metamorphosed into the satyr. The reveling crowd of the votaries of Dionysus rejoices, swayed by such moods and perceptions, the power of which transforms them before their own eyes, so that they imagine they behold themselves as reconstituted genii of nature, as satyrs. The later constitution of the tragic chorus is the artistic imitation of this natural phenomenon, which of course required a separation of the Dionysian spectators from the enchanted Dionysians. However, we must never lose sight of the fact that the public of the Attic tragedy rediscovered itself in the chorus of the orchestra, that there was in reality no antithesis of public and chorus, for all was but one great sublime chorus of dancing and singing satyrs, or of such as allowed themselves to be represented by the satyrs. The Schlegelian observation must here reveal itself to us in a deeper sense. The chorus is the ideal spectator in so far as it is the only beholder, the beholder of the visionary world of the scene. A public of spectators, as known to us, was unknown to the Greeks. In their theatres, the terraced structure of the spectator's space, rising in concentric arcs, enabled every one, in the strictest sense, to overlook the entire world of culture around him, and in surfeited contemplation to imagine himself a chorist. According to this view, then, we may call the chorus in its primitive stage in proto-tragedy a self-mirroring of the Dionysian man, a phenomenon which may be best exemplified by the process of the actor who, if he be truly gifted, sees hovering before his eyes with almost tangible perceptibility the character he is to represent. The satiric chorus is first of all a vision of the Dionysian throng, just as the world of the stage is in turn a vision of the satiric chorus. The power of this vision is great enough to render the eye dull and insensible to the impression of reality, to the presence of the cultured men occupying the tiers of seats on every side. The form of the Greek theatre reminds one of a lonesome mountain valley. The architecture of the scene appears like a luminous cloud picture, which the Bacchantes, swarming on the mountains, behold from the heights, as the splendid encirclement, in the midst of which the image of Dionysus is revealed to them. Owing to our learned conception of the elementary artistic processes, this artistic proto-phenomenon, which is here introduced to explain the tragic chorus, is almost shocking, while nothing can be more certain than that the poet is a poet only in that he beholds himself surrounded by forms which live and act before him, into the innermost being of which his glance penetrates. By reason of a strange defeat in our capacities, we modern men are apt to represent to ourselves the aesthetic proto-phenomenon as too complex and abstract. For the true poet, the metaphor is not a rhetorical figure, but a vicarious image, which actually hovers before him in place of a concept. The character is not for him an aggregate, composed of a studied collection of particular traits, but an irrepressibly live person, appearing before his eyes, and differing only from the corresponding vision of the painter by its ever continued life and action. Why is it that Homer sketches much more vividly than all the other poets? Because he contemplates much more. We talk so abstractly about poetry because we are all want to be bad poets. At bottom, the aesthetic phenomenon is simple. Let a man but have the faculty of perpetually seeing a lively play, and of constantly living surrounded by hosts of spirits, then he is a poet. Let him but feel the impulse to transform himself, and to talk from out the bodies and souls of others, then he is a dramatist. The Dionysian excitement is able to impart to a whole mass of men this artistic faculty of seeing themselves surrounded by such a host of spirits, with whom they know themselves to be inwardly one. This function of the tragic chorus is the dramatic proto-phenomenon, to see one's self transformed before one's self, and then to act as if one had really entered into another body, into another character. This function stands at the beginning of the development of the drama. Here we have something different from the rhapsodist, who does not blend with his pictures, but only sees them, like the painter, with contemplative eye outside of him. Here we actually have a surrender of the individual by his entering into another nature. Moreover, this phenomenon appears in the form of an epidemic. A whole throng feels itself metamorphosed in this wise. Hence it is that the dithyramb is essentially different from every other variety of the choric song. The virgins, who with laurel twigs in their hands solemnly proceed to the temple of Apollo and sing a processional hymn, remain what they are and retain their civic names. The dithyrambic chorus is a chorus of transformed beings whose civic, past, and social rank are totally forgotten. They have become the timeless servants of their God, that live aloof from all the spheres of society. Every other variety of the choric lyric of the Hellenes is but an enormous enhancement of the Apollonian unit singer, while in the dithyramb we have before us a community of unconscious actors, who mutually regard themselves as transformed among one another. This enchantment is the prerequisite of all dramatic art. In this enchantment the Dionysian reveller sees himself as a satyr, and as satyr he in turn beholds the god. That is, in his transformation he sees a new vision outside him as the Apollonian consummation of his state. With this new vision the drama is complete. According to this view, we must understand Greek tragedy as the Dionysian chorus, which always disburdens itself anew in an Apollonian world of pictures. The choric parts, therefore, with which tragedy is interlaced, are in a manner the mother womb of the entire so-called dialogue, that is, of the whole stage world of the drama proper. In several successive outbursts does this primordial basis of tragedy beam forth the vision of the drama, which is a dream phenomenon throughout, and as such epic in character. On the other hand, however, as objectivation of a Dionysian state, it does not represent the Apollonian redemption in appearance, but conversely the dissolution of the individual, and his unification with primordial existence. Accordingly, the drama is the Apollonian embodiment of Dionysian perceptions and influences, and is thereby separated from the epic as by an immense gap. The chorus of Greek tragedy, the symbol of the mass of the people moved by Dionysian excitement, is thus fully explained by our conception of it as here set forth. Whereas being accustomed to the position of a chorus on the modern stage, especially an operatic chorus, we could never comprehend why the tragic chorus of the Greeks should be older, more primitive, indeed more important than the action proper, as has been so plainly declared by the voice of tradition, whereas furthermore we could not reconcile with this traditional paramount importance and primitiveness the fact of the chorus being composed only of humble ministering beings, indeed at first only of goat-like satyrs, whereas finally the orchestra before the scene was always a riddle to us. We have learned to comprehend at length that the scene, together with the action, was fundamentally and originally conceived only as a vision, that the only reality is just the chorus, which of itself generates the vision, and speaks thereof with the entire symbolism of dancing, tone, and word. This chorus beholds in the vision its lord and master Dionysus, and is thus forever the serving chorus. It sees how he, the god, suffers and glorifies himself, and therefore does not itself act. But though its attitude towards the god is throughout the attitude of ministration, this is nevertheless the highest expression, the Dionysian expression of nature, and therefore, like nature herself, the chorus utters oracles and wise sayings when transported with enthusiasm. As fellow sufferer, it is also the sage proclaiming truth from out the heart of nature. Thus, then, originates the fantastic figure, which seems so shocking, of the wise and enthusiastic satyr, who is at the same time the dumb man, in contrast to the god, the image of nature and her strongest impulses, yea, the symbol of nature, and at the same time the herald of her art and wisdom, musician, poet, dancer, and visionary in one person. Agreeably to this view, and agreeably to tradition, Dionysus, the proper stage hero and focus of vision, is not at first actually present in the oldest period of tragedy, but is only imagined as present. That is, tragedy is originally only chorus and not drama. Later on, the attempt is made to exhibit the god as real, and to display the visionary figure together with its glorifying encirclement before the eyes of all. It is here that the drama, in the narrow sense of the term, begins. To the dithyrambic chorus is now assigned the task of exciting the minds of the hearers to such a pitch of Dionysian frenzy, that when the tragic hero appears on the stage, they do not behold in him, say, the unshapely masked man, but a visionary figure, born, as it were, of their own ecstasy. Let us picture Admetes thinking in profound meditation of his lately departed wife Alcestis, and quite consuming himself in spiritual contemplation thereof, when suddenly the veiled figure of a woman, resembling her in form and gait, is led towards him. Let us picture his sudden trembling anxiety, his agitated comparisons, his instinctive conviction, and we shall have an analogon to the sensation with which the spectator, excited to Dionysian frenzy, saw the god approaching on the stage, a god with whose sufferings he had already become identified. He involuntarily transferred the entire picture of the god, fluttering magically before his soul, to this masked figure, and resolved its reality, as it were, into a phantasmal unreality. This is the Apollonian dream state, in which the world of day is veiled, and a new world, clearer, more intelligible, more striking than the former, and nevertheless more shadowy, is ever born anew in perpetual change before our eyes. We accordingly recognize in tragedy a thorough-going stylistic contrast. The language, color, flexibility, and dynamics of the dialogue fall apart in the Dionysian lyrics of the chorus on the one hand, and in the Apollonian dream world of the scene on the other, into entirely separate spheres of expression. The Apollonian appearances in which Dionysus objectifies himself are no longer ein ewiges Meer, ein wechselnd Weben, ein glühend Leben, as is the music of the chorus. They are no longer the forces merely felt, but not condensed into a picture, by which the inspired votary of Dionysus divines the proximity of his god. The clearness and firmness of epic form now speak to him from the scene. Dionysius now no longer speaks through forces, but as an epic hero, almost in the language of Homer. End of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of the Birth of Tragedy by Friedrich Nietzsche. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9. Whatever rises to the surface in the dialogue of the Apollonian part of Greek tragedy appears simple, transparent, beautiful. In this sense, the dialogue is a copy of the Hellene, whose nature reveals itself in the dance, because in the dance the greatest energy is merely potential, but betrays itself nevertheless in flexible and vivacious movements. The language of the Sophoclean heroes, for instance, surprises us by its Apollonian precision and clearness, so that we at once imagine we see into the innermost recesses of their being, and marvel not a little that the way to these recesses is so short. But if, for the moment, we disregard the character of the hero, which rises to the surface and grows visible, and which at bottom is nothing but the light picture cast on a dark wall, that is, appearance through and through; if rather we enter into the myth, which projects itself in these bright mirrorings, we shall of a sudden experience a phenomenon which bears a reverse relation to one familiar in optics. When, after a vigorous effort to gaze into the sun, we turn away blinded, we have dark-coloured spots before our eyes as restoratives, so to speak, while, on the contrary, those light picture phenomena of the Sophoclean hero, in short, the Apollonian of the Masque, are the necessary productions of a glance into the secret and terrible things of nature, as it were, shining spots to heal the eye, which dire night has seared. Only in this sense can we hope to be able to grasp the true meaning of the serious and significant notion of Greek cheerfulness, while of course we encounter the misunderstood notion of this cheerfulness as resulting from a state of unendangered comfort on all the ways and paths of the present time. The most sorrowful figure of the Greek stage, the hapless Oedipus, was understood by Sophocles as the noble man who, in spite of his wisdom, was destined to error and misery, but nevertheless, through his extraordinary sufferings, ultimately exerted a magical wholesome influence on all around him, which continues effective even after his death. The noble man does not sin. This is what the thoughtful poet wishes to tell us. All laws, all natural order, yea, the moral world itself, may be destroyed through his action, but through this very action a higher magic circle of influences is brought into play, which establish a new world on the ruins of the old that has been overthrown. This is what the poet, in so far as he is at the same time a religious thinker, wishes to tell us. As poet, he shows us first of all a wonderfully complicated legal mystery, which the judge slowly unravels, link by link, to his own destruction. The truly Hellenic delight at this dialectical loosening is so great, that a touch of surpassing cheerfulness is thereby communicated to the entire play, which everywhere blunts the edge of the horrible presuppositions of the procedure. In the Oedipus at Colonus we find the same cheerfulness, elevated, however, to an infinite transfiguration, in contrast to the aged king, subjected to an excess of misery, and exposed solely as a sufferer to all that befalls him. We have here a supermundane cheerfulness, which descends from a divine sphere, and intimates to us that in his purely passive attitude the hero attains his highest activity, the influence of which extends far beyond his life, while his earlier conscious musing and striving led him only to passivity. Thus, then, the legal knot of the fable of Oedipus, which to mortal eyes appears indissolubly entangled, is slowly unravelled, and the profoundest human joy comes upon us in the presence of this divine counterpart of dialectics. If this explanation does justice to the poet, it may still be asked whether the substance of the myth is thereby exhausted. And here it turns out that the entire conception of the poet is nothing but the light picture which healing nature holds up to us after a glance into the abyss. Oedipus, the murderer of his father, the husband of his mother, Oedipus, the interpreter of the riddle of the Sphinx, what does the mysterious triad of these deeds of destiny tell us? There is a primitive popular belief, especially in Persia, that a wise Magian can be born only of incest, which we have forthwith to interpret to ourselves with reference to the riddle-solving and mother-marrying Oedipus, to the effect that when the boundary of the present and future, the rigid law of individuation, and in general the intrinsic spell of nature, are broken by prophetic and magical powers, an extraordinary counternaturalness, as in this case incest, must have preceded as a cause. For how else could one force nature to surrender her secrets but by victoriously opposing her, that is, by means of the unnatural? It is this intuition which I see imprinted in the awful triad of the destiny of Oedipus. The very man who solves the riddle of nature, that double constituted sphinx, must also, as the murderer of his father and husband of his mother, break the holiest laws of nature. Indeed, it seems as if the myth sought to whisper into our ears that wisdom, especially Dionysian wisdom, is an unnatural abomination, and that whoever, through his knowledge, plunges nature into an abyss of annihilation, must also experience the dissolution of nature in himself. The sharpness of wisdom turns round upon the sage. Wisdom is a crime against nature. Such terrible expressions does the myth call out to us, but the Hellenic poet touches like a sunbeam the sublime and formidable Memnonian statue of the myth, so that it suddenly begins to sound in Sophoclean melodies. With the glory of passivity, I now contrast the glory of activity which illuminates the Prometheus of Aeschylus, that which Aeschylus, the thinker, had to tell us here, but which as a poet he only allows us to surmise by his symbolic picture. The youthful Goethe succeeded in disclosing to us in the daring words of his Prometheus. Hier sit ich forme Menschen nach meinem Bilde, ein Geschlecht, das mir gleich sei, zu leiden, zu weinen, zu genießen und zu Frauen sich, und ein nicht zu achten, wie ich. Here sit I, forming mankind in my image, a race resembling me, to sorrow and to weep, to taste, to hold, to enjoy, and not have need of thee, as I. Man, elevating himself to the rank of the Titans, acquires his culture by his own efforts, and compels the gods to unite with him, because, in his self-sufficient wisdom, he has their existence and their limits in his hand. What is most wonderful, however, in this Promethean form, which according to its fundamental conception is the specific hymn of impiety, is the profound Aeschylean yearning for justice, the untold sorrow of the bold single-handed being on the one hand, and the divine need, ay, the foreboding of a twilight of the gods on the other. The power of these two worlds of suffering constraining to reconciliation, to metaphysical oneness, all this suggests most forcibly the central and main position of the Aeschylean view of things, which sees Moira as eternal justice enthroned above gods and men. In view of the astonishing boldness with which Aeschylus places the Olympian world on his scales of justice, it must be remembered that the deep-minded Greek had an immovably firm substratum of metaphysical thought in his mysteries, and that all his sceptical paroxysms could be discharged upon the Olympians. With reference to these deities, the Greek artist, in particular, had an obscure feeling as to mutual dependency, and it is just in the Prometheus of Aeschylus that this feeling is symbolized. The Titanic artist found in himself the daring belief that he could create men and at least destroy Olympian deities. namely, by his superior wisdom, for which, to be sure, he had to atone by eternal suffering. The splendid canning of the great genius bought too cheaply, even at the price of eternal suffering, the stern pride of the artist. This is the essence and soul of Aeschylean poetry, while Sophocles, in his Oedipus preluding, strikes up the victory song of the saint. But even this interpretation which Aeschylus has given to the myth does not fathom its astounding depth of terror. The fact is rather that the artist's delight in unfolding, the cheerfulness of artistic creating, bidding defiance to all calamity, is but a shining stellar and nebular image reflected in a black sea of sadness. The tale of Prometheus is an original possession of the entire Aryan family of races, and documentary evidence of their capacity for the profoundly tragic. Indeed, it is not improbable that this myth has the same characteristic significance for the Aryan race that the myth of the fall of man has for the Semitic, and that there is a relationship between the two myths like that of brother and sister. The presupposition of the Promethean myth is the transcendent value which a naive humanity attach to fire as the true palladium of every ascending culture. That man, however, should dispose at will of this fire, and should not receive it only as a gift from heaven, as the igniting lightning or the warming solar flame, appeared to the contemplative primordial men as crime and robbery of the divine nature. And thus the first philosophical problem at once causes a painful, irreconcilable antagonism between man and God, and puts, as it were, a mass of rock at the gate of every culture. The best and highest that men can acquire they obtain by a crime, and must now in their turn take upon themselves its consequences, namely the whole flood of sufferings and sorrows with which the offended celestials must visit the nobly aspiring race of man. A bitter reflection, which by the dignity it confers on crime, contrasts strangely with the Semitic myth of the fall of man, in which curiosity, beguilement, seducibility, wantonness, in short, a whole series of preeminently feminine passions were regarded as the origin of evil. What distinguishes the Aryan representation is the sublime view of active sin as the properly Promethean virtue, which suggests at the same time the ethical basis of pessimistic tragedy as the justification of human evil, of human guilt as well as of the suffering incurred thereby. The misery in the essence of things, which the contemplative Aryan is not disposed to explain away, the antagonism in the heart of the world, manifests itself to him as a medley of different worlds, for instance, a divine and a human world, each of which is in the right individually, but as a separate existence alongside of another has to suffer for its individuation. With the heroic effort made by the individual for universality in his attempt to pass beyond the bounds of individuation and become the one universal being, he experiences in himself the primordial contradiction concealed in the essence of things, that is, he trespasses and suffers. Accordingly, crime is understood by the Aryans to be a man, sin by the Semites a woman, as also the original crime is committed by man, the original sin by woman. Besides, the witches' chorus says, Wir nehmen das nicht so genau, mit 1000 Schritten macht's die Frau, doch wie sie auch sich eilen kann, mit einem Sprung macht der Mann. We do not measure with such care, woman in 1000 steps is there, but howsoever she hasten may, man in one leap has cleared the way. He who understands this innermost core of the tale of Prometheus, namely, the necessity of crime imposed on the titanically striving individual, will at once be conscious of the un-Apollonian nature of this pessimistic representation. 4. Apollo seeks to pacify individual beings precisely by drawing boundary lines between them, and by again and again calling attention thereto with his requirements of self-knowledge and due proportion, as the holiest laws of the universe. In order, however, to prevent the form from congealing to Egyptian rigidity and coldness, in consequence of this Apollonian tendency, in order to prevent the extinction of the motion of the entire lake, in the effort to prescribe to the individual wave its path and compass, the high tide of the Dionysian tendency destroyed from time to time all the little circles in which the one-sided Apollonian will sought to confine the Hellenic world. The suddenly swelling tide of the Dionysian then takes the separate little wave mountains of individuals on its back, just as the brother of Prometheus, the Titan Atlas, does with the earth. This titanic impulse to become, as it were, the Atlas of all individuals, and to carry them on broad shoulders higher and higher, farther and farther, is what the Promethean and the Dionysian have in common. In this respect the Aeschylean Prometheus is a Dionysian mask, while in the aforementioned profound yearning for justice, Aeschylus betrays to the intelligent observer his paternal descent from Apollo, the god of individuation and of the boundaries of justice. And so the double being of the Aeschylean Prometheus, his conjoint Dionysian and Apollonian nature, might be thus expressed in an abstract formula: whatever exists is alike just and unjust, and equally justified in both. Das ist deine Welt, das heißt eine Welt. This is thy world, and what a world. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of the Birth of Tragedy by Friedrich Nietzsche. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10. It is an indisputable tradition that Greek tragedy in its earliest form had for its theme only the sufferings of Dionysus, and that for some time the only stage hero therein was simply Dionysus himself. With the same confidence, however, we can maintain that not until Euripides did Dionysus cease to be the tragic hero, and that in fact all the celebrated figures of the Greek stage, Prometheus, Oedipus, etc., are but masks of this original hero, Dionysus. The presence of a god behind all these masks is the one essential cause of the typical ideality, so oft exciting wonder, of these celebrated figures. Someone, I know not whom, has maintained that all individuals are comic as individuals, and are consequently untragic, from whence it might be inferred that the Greeks in general could not endure individuals on the tragic stage, and they really seem to have had these sentiments, as in general it is to be observed that the Platonic discrimination and valuation of the idea, in contrast to the eidolon, the image, is deeply rooted in the Hellenic being. Availing ourselves of Plato's terminology, however, we should have to speak of the tragic figures of the Hellenic stage somewhat as follows. The one truly real Dionysus appears in a multiplicity of forms, in the mask of a fighting hero, and entangled, as it were, in the net of an individual will. As the visibly appearing god now talks and acts, he resembles an erring, striving, suffering individual, and that, in general, he appears with such epic precision and clearness is due to the dream-reading Apollo, who reads to the chorus its Dionysian state through this symbolic appearance. In reality, however, this hero is the suffering Dionysus of the mysteries, a god experiencing in himself the sufferings of individuation, of whom wonderful myths tell that as a boy he was dismembered by the Titans and has been worshipped in this state as Zagreus, whereby is intimated that this dismemberment, the properly Dionysian suffering, is like a transformation into air, water, earth, and fire, that we must therefore regard the state of individuation as the source and primal cause of all suffering, as something objectionable in itself. From the smile of this Dionysus sprang the Olympian gods, from his tears sprang man. In his existence as a dismembered god, Dionysus has the dual nature of a cruel, barbarized demon and a mild, pacific ruler. But the hope of the epochs looked for a new birth of Dionysus, which we have now to conceive of in anticipation as the end of individuation. It was for this coming third Dionysus that the stormy jubilation hymns of the epochs resounded, and it is only this hope that sheds a ray of joy upon the features of a world torn asunder and shattered into individuals, as is symbolized in the myth by Demeter, sunk in eternal sadness, who rejoices again only when told that she may once more give birth to Dionysus. In the views of things here given, we already have all the elements of a profound and pessimistic contemplation of the world, and along with these we have the mystery doctrine of tragedy, the fundamental knowledge of the oneness of all existing things, the consideration of individuation as the primal cause of evil, and art as the joyous hope that the spell of individuation may be broken, as the augury of a restored oneness. It has already been intimated that the Homeric epos is the poem of Olympian culture, wherewith this culture has sung its own song of triumph over the terrors of the war of the Titans. Under the predominating influence of tragic poetry, these Homeric myths are now reproduced anew, and show by this metempsychosis that meantime the Olympian culture also has been vanquished by a still deeper view of things. The haughty Titan Prometheus has announced to his Olympian tormentor that the extremest danger will one day menace his rule unless he ally with him betimes. In Aeschylus we perceive the terrified Zeus, apprehensive of his end, in alliance with the Titan. Thus the former age of the Titans is subsequently brought from Tartarus once more to the light of day. The philosophy of wild and naked nature beholds with the undissembled mien of truth the myths of the Homeric world as they dance past. They turn pale, they tremble before the lightning glance of this goddess, till the powerful fist of the Dionysian artist forces them into the service of the new deity. Dionysian truth takes over the entire domain of myth as symbolism of its knowledge, which it makes known partly in the public cult of tragedy and partly in the secret celebration of the dramatic mysteries, always, however, in the old mythical garb. What was the power which freed Prometheus from his vultures and transformed the myth into a vehicle of Dionysian wisdom? It is the Heraclean power of music, which, having reached its highest manifestness in tragedy, can invest myths with a new and most profound significance, which we have already had occasion to characterize as the most powerful faculty of music. For it is the fate of every myth to insinuate itself into the narrow limits of some alleged historical reality, and to be treated by some later generation as a solitary fact with historical claims. And the Greeks were already fairly on the way to restamp the whole of their mythical juvenile dream sagaciously and arbitrarily into a historico-pragmatical juvenile history. For this is the manner in which religions are wont to die out, when of course under the stern, intelligent eyes of an orthodox dogmatism the mythical presuppositions of a religion are systematized as a completed sum of historical events, and when one begins apprehensively to defend the credibility of the myth, while at the same time opposing all continuation of their natural vitality and luxuriance, when accordingly the feeling for myth dies out, and its place is taken by the claim of religion to historical foundations. This dying myth was now seized by the newborn genius of Dionysian music, in whose hands it bloomed once more with such colors as it had never yet displayed, with a fragrance that awakened a longing anticipation of a metaphysical world. After this final effulgence it collapses, its leaves wither, and soon the scoffing Lucians of antiquity catch at the discolored and faded flowers which the winds carry off in every direction. Through tragedy, the myth attains its profoundest significance, its most expressive form. It rises once more like a wounded hero, and the whole surplus of vitality, together with the philosophical calmness of the dying, burns in its eyes with a last powerful gleam. What meanest thou, O impious Euripides, in seeking once more to enthrall this dying one? He died under thy ruthless hands, and then thou madest use of counterfeit masked myth, which, like the ape of Heracles, could only trick itself out in the old finery. And as myth died in thy hands, so also died the genius of music. Though thou couldst covetously plunder all the gardens of music, thou didst only realize a counterfeit, masked music. And because thou hast forsaken Dionysus, Apollo hath also forsaken thee. Rout up all the passions from their haunts, and conjure them into thy sphere. Sharpen and polish a sophistical dialectics for the speeches of thy heroes. Thy very heroes have only counterfeit masked passions, and speak only counterfeit masked music. End of chapter 10.